In this edition of Global Print, I'm going to talk to you about something that is very different from the ongoing foreign policy and strategic issues that have confronted us these last few days, whether it was about the Quad or the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum for Shared Prosperity. I'm instead going to talk to you about the visit of Rahul Gandhi, the Congress leader, to Cambridge a few days ago, in which he made a speech, talked about China. The comment that has been all over social media is about the Indian Foreign Service. According to him, they have become the diplomats of the Indian Foreign Service are now much more arrogant. The External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, has responded to that comment saying that the service is not arrogant. In fact, it's confident. But that's not what I want to talk to you about in this edition of Global Print. But before I do that, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you, which is to please join and become a subscriber to The Print. Pay rupees 159 only. Click on the join button and you will get privileges and benefits that non-subscribers don't have. And these are wide and varied, and I promise you that being a part of The Print's free, fair, objective, and non-hyphenated journalism will be something that will definitely appeal to you. So do continue to support us as you have done these last several months of the pandemic and since. And we look forward to your paying this very small amount of money so that we can continue with the best journalism that you demand as your right. Now, in my column in Global Print that was published on the Print's website a few days ago, I talk about Rahul Gandhi's visit to the UK. He went with several other politicians from other political parties. But this particular speech, or this particular interaction, shall we say, at Cambridge in the UK, got a lot of attention because he talked about how the Indian Foreign Service, he talked about other things as well, but in this particular case, he talks about the Indian Foreign Service becoming very arrogant. And that provoked a very interesting remark from the External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, and he said, yes, the Indian Foreign Service is a very confident service. We do listen to our government, we have changed, but we are not arrogant, we are confident. Now, this is an unusual exchange. In the good old days, if you remember, not so long ago, in the early 90s, actually, when then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, he belonged to the Congress Party, of course, but when India was being hammered at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, he asked the then opposition leader Atal Bihari Vajpayee of the BJP to lead a delegation to Geneva, which had a junior Minister of State of External Affairs, Salman Khurshid. So remember, the Congress Party, Salman Khurshid, was not the leader of the delegation. It was the BJP senior leader, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who led India's delegation at Geneva. So those were the days when foreign policy was above politics. It was above this ugly tu me that we see all the time in domestic politics. A fracture in domestic politics did not translate into a fracture in foreign policy because India was seen as above political differences or domestic political differences. Unfortunately, these last few years, these last decade and a half, that consensus on India's foreign policy has also come to an end. It's melted. It's also fractured. So nobody looks at India's national interest as being above everything else. And that was a manifestation in this exchange between Congress leader Rahul Gandhi and the External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar. But that's the first point that I'd like to make, which is that the consensus on foreign policy is now a fractured one. So the second point that I'd like to make is that actually Rahul Gandhi made some interesting comments in that interaction at Cambridge. He also said that he talked about China, he talked about Ukraine, he talked about Vladimir Putin's Russia. It was a mention of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course. But one of the most interesting things he said was that in a conversation with Mr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, they both talked about China and the fact that Chinese troops are on the line of actual control and have been there for the last couple of years. And when he said to Mr. Jaishankar, that is when Rahul Gandhi said to Mr. Jaishankar that he was worried that Chinese troops have been sitting on the LAC in Ladakh for the last couple of years, he says, Mr. Jaishankar said, you have a point. Now, whether or not this translates into agreement between the two gentlemen in question, that is Rahul Gandhi and Mr. Jaishankar, is a moot point. But one would construe this to mean that both these gentlemen were talking about a serious matter which affects India's foreign policy and is at the root of India's foreign policy, or at the heart of the challenges that India faces and has been for the last few years. In fact, you could argue that because the Chinese have been sitting on your border or on the line of actual control for the last couple of years, in fact, inside your territory, and that's why you've had 15 rounds of talks between India and China these last couple of years. Now, some of those talks have led to some disengagement, especially on the Pangong Tso Lake, but others have not. So you still have some points within Indian territory, say in the Galwan Valley, in the Depsang Plains, where Chinese troops still maintain a presence. So there is certainly a great deal of concern in the Indian establishment that the Chinese troops are still there, they're still present. And although India is holding them off, which means that they haven't been able to make any further movement, they are still present on Indian territory. Now, the question is that all sides, the Indian political establishment is clearly concerned, and that's what Rahul Gandhi talks about. Now, in this particular conversation between Mr. Gandhi and Mr. Jaishankar, both of them clearly share their concern, which is a good thing, which means that this fracture that I earlier referred to is thankfully not complete, and that there still can be conversations between the ruling party and the opposition. And I would argue, in fact, that India's initiatives in the Indo-Pacific, whether it is India's increasing participation in the Quad, and you know that there was a second in-person summit in Tokyo earlier this week between Prime Minister Modi, the Prime Ministers of Japan and Australia, and US President Joe Biden. And the reason India has participated with such gusto in the Quad Summit, as well as being a part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is because India is concerned about China's expanding presence in the Indo-Pacific, and certainly in the Himalayas as well. So China remains at the heart of the Indian foreign policy and security challenge. Now, in this situation where you have both key leaders in the Indian political and security establishment, that's the Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, and a key Congress leader who are talking about their concerns, one would hope and one hopes that politicians will come together and hammer out some sort of understanding and some sort of consensus on how to deal with the dragon in the room. And the dragon in the room is clearly China. In fact, what Rahul Gandhi goes on to say in his conversation in Cambridge is that, and he's asked about India's foreign policy challenges, and the conversation turns to Russia. Now, Russia, as we all know, has been an old friend and partner of India's, but Russia has invaded an independent and sovereign nation, Ukraine, for the last 3 months. And while there have been some successes, it has captured the port city of Mariupol, which is on the Black Sea. Other parts of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, which border Russia, are now also more or less under Russian control. The question is that India's commentary on the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been very muted. We know that. It's been very moderated because of India's relationship with Russia. But Rahul Gandhi says and that's how he brings up Ukraine in this conversation, is that Vladimir Putin's Russia has invaded an independent and sovereign country called Ukraine. And that has parallels with the Indian situation. And that's how he comes to the China parallel, which is that China is sitting on your border for the last 2 years. It has a definite presence on your territory. Now, he says, he doesn't say, of course, that the Chinese could at any time expand that presence, or that situation could become a dangerous one. It's highly unlikely that it will, because Indian troops are there, they're guarding your frontier, they're guarding your border, and they're not going to allow Chinese troops to do that. But the fact is that there is a concern about the China challenge. So Rahul Gandhi says, and in that context, I think that there should be a greater public conversation on what the Chinese are doing. And in this context, Rahul Gandhi goes on to add that in Parliament, there should be a bigger conversation, and he hopes that Prime Minister Narendra Modi will allow a greater debate and a discussion on what the Chinese are doing in not just in Ladakh, but across the board, inside India, on the borders of India, as well as in the region. Now, that's a fair point that the opposition leader is making, is that we all hope that we can discuss threadbare what's happening with China. On the one hand, the Prime Minister's participation on behalf of India at the Quad is very welcome. India's participation at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is also very welcome. But what does it mean at the end of the day when a broader discussion is not held in Parliament, or is not allowed to be held, where other MPs from across the political spectrum can perhaps thrash these matters out? And this airing, this greater transparency will definitely be for the good for all of us Indian citizens. So I'm going to leave it there, but I would encourage you to read my column on the Print's website. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about this video. Thank you so much for watching.